Sometimes the quietest streets hide the deepest secrets, and a single bloom beneath the vines can whisper of something long buried. What do we carry from the past when the truth finally comes to light? And who are we once the lies begin to unravel? Where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. The Widow of Wisteria Court. The rain fell softly that morning in Cabot Cove, a gentle hush blanketing the rooftops and gardens as Jessica Fletcher trimmed the edges of her rosebush. Dew clung to her gloves, and the scent of damp earth mingled with the faint trace of old lilacs drifting from the hedge. It was a kind of morning Jessica liked best, unhurried, contemplative, touched by memory. Inside, the tea kettle began to whistle. She set her gloves aside, brushed the soil from her palms, and stepped back into her kitchen. On the oak table lay her morning mail, mostly unremarkable: 2 bills, a postcard from Seth, and one envelope that did not quite belong, cream-colored, thick, addressed in a precise hand she didn't recognize. No return address. Jessica tilted her head, considering it. The postmark was from Connecticut. She poured her tea, sat down, and slid the envelope between her fingers before finally breaking the seal. The paper inside was neatly folded, and for some reason she hesitated before reading it, as if something within already knew that this letter, unlike the others, carried the weight of a story that had not yet ended. The letter opened with a formal salutation. "Dear Mrs. Fletcher," followed by a paragraph crafted in careful, deliberate handwriting. The tone was polite, but not cold, filled with a quiet elegance that struck Jessica as both practiced and vulnerable. It was signed by Evelyn Harrow, a name Jessica didn't immediately place. But as she read further, details began to align. Evelyn mentioned a book signing in Hartford, years ago, where they had exchanged a brief conversation about her late husband's love of gardening and Jessica's first novel. A small moment, easily forgotten by most. And yet the letter conveyed that Evelyn had remembered it with clarity. Now Evelyn wrote, she was reaching out under unusual circumstances. Her husband had passed away, and she was hosting a small memorial gathering at her home in Wisteria Court, just outside New Haven. Jessica had been one of the few names he had spoken fondly in his final months, Evelyn claimed. Whether it was nostalgia or coincidence, she felt it right to invite her. Jessica paused and read the last line again. "There are things I never understood about the man I married. I wonder now if anyone truly did." Jessica turned the letter over, then back again, her brow faintly creased. Richard Harrow. That was the name. Evelyn's husband. It struck her with the weight of an echo, not loud, but resonant. She rose from the table and crossed to her study, thumbing through the bookshelf where press clippings and reader letters were stored. She found it tucked inside a folder from 1997, a brief mention in a local paper about an arts charity gala in Hartford, attended by retired horticulturist Richard Harrow and his wife Evelyn. There had been something about him then, she remembered, a man who lingered at the edge of a crowd, always watching but seldom speaking. Jessica had only glimpsed him once or twice that evening, and even then, he'd seemed older than his years, not frail, but weary, as if carrying the weight of something unspoken. She returned to the letter and read it again, this time more slowly. There was something Evelyn wasn't saying, a subtext between the lines, restrained and private. Jessica had learned to recognize that tone. It wasn't grief alone that had prompted the invitation, it was perhaps confusion, or even guilt, and beneath it all something quietly unsettling. Jessica carried her tea to the living room and settled into the armchair by the window, watching the rain trace slow lines across the glass. The letter rested on her lap, folded once more, but her mind returned to it like a question left unanswered. There had been no mention of other guests, only that the gathering would be small, private, more reflection than ceremony. That Evelyn would understand entirely if Jessica declined, and yet the invitation didn't feel optional. Not in the way it was written, it was less of a request and more of an opening, a carefully crafted door into a room no one else had been willing to enter. Jessica had seen it before, the subtle way people reach out when they're too proud to ask directly for help, or too frightened of what they might uncover. She turned the letter over once again, her fingers brushing the signature. Evelyn Harrow. Why now? Why her? She rose and walked to her writing desk, opening the drawer where she kept her travel notes. The town of Wisteria Court wasn't large, a quiet cluster of old homes, if she remembered correctly, not a place that made headlines. Jessica had no reason to be suspicious, and yet there was something hollow behind the elegance of Evelyn's words. A missing piece, delicately hidden, and that was precisely the kind of silence that always made Jessica listen more closely. By late afternoon, the rain had thinned to a mist, and the clouds hung low over the hills. Jessica set her tea aside, pulled out the slim New England map book she still preferred over her phone, and traced her finger along the coast of Connecticut. There, Wisteria Court. Less than 2 hours inland. She picked up the phone and dialed the number Evelyn had written in her letter. The line rang twice before a soft voice answered. Not Evelyn's, but someone younger. A housekeeper, perhaps. Jessica left her name and request to reserve a room at the local inn, as the letter suggested. There was a pause before the young woman replied that yes, a room had already been set aside, under Mrs. Fletcher's name. The call ended politely, but not without a trace of hesitation. Jessica placed the receiver back on the cradle and stood still for a moment, absorbing the quiet. She was no stranger to unexpected invitations, but something about this felt different, not dangerous, no, but delicately tangled. She folded the letter once more and slipped it into her travel folder. She would leave in the morning, not because she feared something had gone wrong, but because something in Evelyn's words, or what was left unsaid between them, lingered like a perfume that clung long after the wearer had departed. Jessica turned to pack, her thoughts already drifting toward Wisteria Court, and the story that waited beneath its elegant silence. The car moved slowly up the gravel path, its tires shimmering against the neatly lined stones that led to Wisteria Court. Jessica sat back, gazing through the window at the row of elegant houses that encircled the small cul-de-sac like porcelain figurines placed just so, immaculate, unmoving, and curiously alike. There was a peculiar stillness in the air, as though even the wind hesitated to intrude. The wisteria vines along the entrance trellises were already beginning to wilt in the early autumn light, their blossoms curling inward with a kind of reluctant grace. Jessica noted the hedges, expertly trimmed, perhaps too expertly, a place where everything seemed in order, but nothing felt at ease. The car slowed outside number 6. She stepped out, suitcase in hand, and took in the house. Pale blue shutters, brass knocker polished to a near mirror. Not a single leaf out of place on the walkway. And yet, beneath the perfection, Jessica felt a strange tightness, not in the air, but in the atmosphere, a silence that was less peace than pause, as though something had been left unfinished here. She climbed the 3 stone steps, lifted her hand, and rang the bell. The door opened promptly, revealing Evelyn Harrow framed in soft light, her silver blonde hair pinned with discreet precision, a long ivory cardigan drawn around her like a veil. "Jessica," she said with a faint smile that almost held, "how kind of you to come." Her voice, like the house behind her, was elegant and composed, and Jessica was struck not by sorrow but by its absence. Grief, when genuine, had a weight to it. Here, it hovered politely at the margins, never daring to enter the room. Evelyn led her through the foyer, polished hardwood, subtle floral arrangements, and not a photograph in sight. The sitting room was arranged for comfort, but bore the untouched stiffness of a display. Jessica's eyes settled on the fireplace mantel, where a brass clock ticked softly beside a faded gardening award. Richard always liked the house to be. Just so, Evelyn said, noticing Jessica's gaze. He believed appearances kept the world steady. Jessica nodded, but she thought some homes carry too much quiet. They paused near the window where sheer curtains filtered the daylight into soft gold. Evelyn gestured toward the tea tray, her hands steady, practiced. Everything about her welcome was gracious, and nothing about it felt natural. Later that afternoon, Jessica wandered briefly out onto the front path, notebook tucked under one arm, under the pretense of getting a breath of air. Evelyn had retired to her study for some telephone calls, and Jessica had sensed a lull in which to quietly observe. Across the way, a curtain shifted. A figure stood half-shadowed behind a pane, a woman of about 70, angular features framed by a rigid hairstyle. She didn't wave, just watched. Jessica offered a small nod. The curtain fell. "That's Iris Donnelly," came a voice from the garden gate. Jessica turned to see a slender man, perhaps in his 60s, with a wool scarf wrapped twice around his neck, despite the mild day. "Former librarian," he added, with a tired smile. "Still catalogues everything, even people." "Jessica Fletcher," she said, extending her hand. "Thomas Bellamy, composer, retired, mostly." Jessica noted the way his gaze drifted toward Evelyn's house. It wasn't curiosity, it was calculation. Then, as if remembering himself, he added softly, "A lovely afternoon for a walk, isn't it?" Jessica agreed, but as he turned away, a younger woman stepped out from Evelyn's side path, short, broad-shouldered, in a pale uniform dress. Celia Marsh, she assumed, the housekeeper. Celia nodded but said nothing, her eyes flicking between Jessica and the other houses. Polite, blank, careful. Wisteria Court, Jessica thought, was full of watchers, but none of them, it seemed, trusted what they saw. They sat in Evelyn's drawing room after supper, a fire now lit, though the evening was only slightly chilled. The flames flickered against the porcelain vases and glossy furniture, casting long, slow-moving shadows across the room. Tea was poured, the clink of silver against porcelain offering the only rhythm to their halting conversation. "He would have been glad you came," Evelyn said softly. "Richard admired your writing. He said it reminded him of things we forget too easily." Jessica sipped her tea, watching the woman's fingers as they absently toyed with the edge of a napkin. "I'm sorry I never had the chance to know him better," she said gently. "He always struck me as private." Evelyn nodded. "Yes, private, even with me, in some ways." Her voice caught, then steadied. "Toward the end, he withdrew. We thought it was the medication or the fatigue. But he began saying things, strange things, about the neighbors, about the garden, about someone watching him. Did you believe him?" Evelyn's eyes lingered on the fire. "I believed he was frightened, and I believed he had his reasons, but he wouldn't explain." She set down her teacup with too much care. "It was difficult, Jessica, that time, not just for him." Jessica didn't press, but she noted the slight tremble in Evelyn's breath, and how carefully her memories avoided clarity, like a path swept just enough to suggest no one had passed. The kitchen was still when Jessica entered later, hoping to return her teacup herself, more out of instinct than necessity. Celia Marsh stood at the counter, sorting dried herbs into glass jars with methodical precision. "You don't have to do that tonight," Jessica offered kindly. Celia looked up. Her face was broad, steady, her eyes pale and unreadable. "I like order," she said simply. Jessica nodded. "It's a beautiful home. It must take care to keep it so." Celia's hands paused over the lavender. "It was his house," she said. "She kept it for him. Even after, Jessica thought. She stepped closer, her tone light. "He seemed a man with strong preferences." Celia gave a short breath, not quite a laugh. "That's one way of saying it." Jessica watched her closely. "He ever ask you to watch the neighbors?" Celia's gaze flicked toward the window, then back. "He didn't have to. Around here we all watch each other." There was something more in her voice, not fear, not guilt, but something worn smooth by time and repetition. Jessica offered a gentle thank you and left the cup on the counter. Some silences, she had learned, were rehearsed, and this one had the precision of a script, long memorized. The next morning, Jessica took a quiet stroll through Wisteria Court before breakfast. The sun had emerged, soft and low, painting the sidewalks in amber. She passed each house slowly, pausing when neighbors stepped out to water planters or collect the morning paper. They smiled, thin, brief, and vaguely surprised to see her. She returned their greetings, noting how carefully some avoided mentioning Evelyn. A man in slippers nodded, then turned back toward his door. A woman with a garden hose offered a bright hello, then busied herself without waiting for a reply. Only Iris Donnelly met Jessica's gaze with any steadiness. "Mrs. Harrow doesn't usually have visitors," she said. "But I suppose there's a first time for everything." Jessica thanked her, and continued on. Back near the Harrow house, she paused beneath the arbor where the wisteria was just beginning to shed. A petal drifted down onto her shoulder. She brushed it away slowly, her mind drawing connections she hadn't yet named. A street this quiet shouldn't feel so burdened. And yet something here was unspoken, not buried exactly, but laid carefully beneath layers of propriety. Jessica looked once more toward the house, and the closed windows that had watched her every step. The garden behind Evelyn's home was modest but meticulously kept. Long beds of antique roses formed careful rows, their faded blush petals resting like secrets on damp soil. Jessica walked beside Evelyn in silence, breathing in the heady scent that lingered with late summer's stubbornness. Evelyn moved slowly, a small basket looped over one wrist, secateurs in hand. Her motions were delicate, almost reverent, snipping a brown stem here, lifting a drooping bloom there. Jessica noted how her fingers hovered a moment too long over certain blossoms, as if each were a memory she couldn't quite let go. "He adored this garden," Evelyn murmured, her voice nearly lost in the hush. "Every morning he'd be out here before breakfast. Said the roses listened better than most people." Jessica smiled faintly but said nothing. There was something nearly ritualistic in the way Evelyn moved, not just the tending of flowers, but a preservation of something more fragile. A grief too neatly trimmed. Evelyn bent to collect a fallen petal, her hand brushing the soil. "He believed plants knew when they were being watched. Strange, isn't it? Jessica didn't think so. She believed houses knew too, and gardens, especially gardens, remembered what words left unsaid." They moved along the stone path, Evelyn leading them toward a curved bench beneath a wooden trellis. The wisteria had begun to fade, but its twisted branches still reached across like arms folded in thought. Jessica sat as Evelyn remained standing, gaze trailing along the fence line. The last few weeks he wasn't himself, she said softly. Restless, distracted. He'd wake before dawn and walk the yard like he expected something to happen. Jessica tilted her head. Did he say why? Evelyn hesitated. He said he was waiting, but he didn't say for whom, or what. The silence between them stretched, then Evelyn added, he stopped pruning too, just sat in the garden for hours, listening. Jessica glanced at the rose bushes. They're very well tended. Evelyn blinked, then looked down. I took over, she said quickly. I had to. After, her voice drifted, and she smoothed the side of her skirt. Jessica watched her carefully. It must have been difficult. Evelyn's lips parted as if to answer, then closed. Her posture shifted slightly, as if shrinking inward, protecting something. He'd talk in his sleep sometimes, she continued finally. Mentioned names I didn't recognize, argued with people who weren't there. Once he said someone was standing in the arbor, watching. Jessica's mind filed the details, but she said nothing. Evelyn gave a soft breath. I used to believe he was just aging, growing paranoid. But now, she didn't finish the sentence, and Jessica didn't ask her to. The creak of the side gate interrupted their quiet. Jessica turned toward the sound just as Thomas Bellamy stepped into view. He wore a threadbare grey sweater, and carried a folded newspaper under his arm, his scarf askew as if he'd dressed in haste. Morning, he called, his tone clipped. Didn't realize company was expected. Evelyn straightened. Thomas, this is Jessica Fletcher. I believe you've heard of her. Thomas gave a brief nod, eyes scanning Jessica with the disinterest of someone appraising a sculpture they didn't quite like. Richard mentioned her, he said. Briefly, then without further ceremony, he stepped back through the gate and vanished into his own yard, leaving the latch swinging faintly behind him. Jessica turned back to Evelyn, but before she could speak, another figure appeared, Iris Donnelly, her blouse starched, hair pinned with exacting precision. Well, this garden is as neat as ever, she remarked, eyes drifting past the rosebeds. Such a comfort to see some things don't fall apart. Evelyn's smile faltered. We do our best. I'm sure, Iris replied. Then her gaze settled coldly on Jessica. You'll find that we're all very neighborly here. There was no warmth in her voice, only something brittle, like porcelain, cracked just beneath the glaze. The exchange that followed was brief, pleasantries laced with precision, polite nods polished to perfection. But Jessica's attention narrowed as she caught a moment that neither woman intended to show. As Iris turned to leave, she looked back over her shoulder at Evelyn, not in farewell, but in judgment. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, lips pressed into a thin line. Evelyn met the look without blinking. It was not the glance of old friends, nor even of strained acquaintances. It was something deeper, sharper, a history compressed into a fraction of a second. Resentment, and perhaps something else. Wounded pride maybe, or buried guilt. Jessica's breath caught, but she said nothing. She had learned long ago that such glances were more honest than words. Evelyn turned back to the roses without comment, yet Jessica noticed the slight stiffness in her shoulders, the way her fingers dug just a little too hard into the stem of a nearly wilted bloom. Iris has always been particular, Evelyn said after a moment. Jessica nodded slowly, and very attentive. Evelyn said nothing, but her silence was telling, the kind that came from long-practiced restraint, not fear, but familiarity with danger. Jessica turned her gaze to the trellis. The garden, for all its beauty, had begun to feel like a room with no safe corners. They walked on, the atmosphere noticeably thinner now. Evelyn stopped near a small work table set against the ivy wall, where old tools lay arranged in a neat row, gloves, spade, twine and a pair of rusted shears with worn red handles. She picked up the shears, testing the tension with her thumb. "He never let me touch these," she said absently. "Said they had a feel only he understood." Jessica stepped closer, observing the grooves in the wooden grip, the way the blade stuck slightly when opened wide. "Old tools remember their user," she said gently. Evelyn turned them in her hand once, then held them up to the light. "He used these the day before he collapsed. I remember the sound." She paused, her voice quiet now. "He was cutting back the deadheads." Then he stopped, looked up at the arbor as if someone had called his name. Jessica looked toward the arbor, its lattice partially hidden in shadow. "Did he say what he saw?" "No," Evelyn whispered. But he didn't finish. She set the shears down carefully, as though laying them to rest. "We had an argument the night before," she continued. "Not a loud one, just an old wound resurfacing, about something I thought we'd buried." She turned to Jessica, eyes suddenly clouded. "We never resolved it." Jessica waited, gently, but Evelyn didn't continue. She looked down instead, brushing dust from her palms. "I should go in. There's still laundry," she said, and walked away. And Jessica remained beside the shears, more certain than ever that this garden remembered more than it should. Jessica followed the gravel path slowly, her footsteps muffled by fallen petals and wet earth. Evelyn had already disappeared inside the house, her figure slipping behind the screened door with the silence of someone practiced at retreat. Jessica paused beside the trellis, letting her gaze follow the lines of wisteria as they climbed upward, curling like secrets. The breeze stirred the vines, releasing a faint scent of moss and fading lavender. It reminded her of the way memory lingers, not always vivid, but persistent. There were stories here, not loud ones, but quiet, weighty things that hung in the corners of rooms and settled into the folds of silence. She could feel them in the way Evelyn's fingers clutched the shears, in the look that passed between two women who once, perhaps, knew too much of each other, in the way no one ever quite said Richard's name without softening their voice. She reached out and touched the wooden rail, rough beneath her fingertips, the kind of roughness that came from time, not neglect. Then she turned back toward the house, her eyes lingering once more on the closed garden gate. Some truths didn't bloom. They burrowed, and Jessica knew this garden had been burying more than roses. The morning at Wisteria Court had begun in soft gold, sunlight brushing the edges of rose leaves still beaded with dew. Jessica was seated at the breakfast table with Evelyn, a cup of Earl Grey warming her hands, when the stillness fractured. A scream, high, sharp, unmistakably human, pierced the calm. Evelyn froze mid-sentence. Jessica was already on her feet, following the sound that seemed to echo from the rear of the house. They reached the conservatory together, Evelyn's slippers barely making a sound against the tiled floor. The door stood open, the air inside heavy with the scent of moist soil and crushed petals. Celia Marsh stood near the threshold, one hand over her mouth, the other gripping the frame. Her eyes were wide and fixed on something just beyond the ferns. Jessica stepped forward, her stomach tightening. There, sprawled near a tipped-over planter, lay a man. His frame was slight but familiar, grey jacket, corduroy slacks, one shoe scuffed as if he had turned suddenly. His limbs were awkward, too still. Jessica moved no closer. She didn't need to. The man was Arthur Linney, and nothing in that room, not the warm sunlight, not the bird song outside, could soften the fact that he was dead. Jessica moved carefully around the edge of the conservatory, her eyes scanning before her feet stepped. Evelyn had lowered herself onto the edge of a wicker bench, her knuckles white against her lap. Celia remained near the doorway, muttering something Jessica couldn't catch. Arthur Linney's body lay at a peculiar angle, half collapsed between a potted fern and the base of a tall bookshelf that housed gardening manuals and glass terrariums. The lower shelf had splintered slightly from impact. His eyes were open, staring upward in what looked like surprise rather than pain. His lips were parted. On the tiled floor beside him, almost too neatly, lay a silver letter opener, its handle ornate, a ribbon of what appeared to be soil or rust clinging to the blade. Jessica knelt just far enough to observe. There was no blood, no sign of forced struggle, but the way Arthur's body twisted told her it had not been a peaceful collapse. She glanced at his shoes. One heel had left a faint scuff along the tile, a mark from movement, not stillness. Her gaze moved to the planter beside him, shattered, broken as if knocked in haste. One small leaf clung to his shoulder like a final witness. Behind her, Evelyn whispered, "He wasn't supposed to be here." Jessica stood, her eyes returning to the silver blade. The metal caught the light, cold and indifferent. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't come from anger alone. It had come from something old and unfinished. The news moved through Wisteria Court with the speed and silence of something already half expected. Within the hour, neighbors stood in clumps along the sidewalk, some whispering behind gloved hands, others feigning concern with knitted brows and practiced sympathy. Jessica watched from the window as Iris Donnelly spoke in hushed tones to Thomas Bellamy. Her hand gestured once toward the Harrow house, then again toward the conservatory. Bellamy shook his head, but not in disagreement, more in the manner of someone confirming the inevitable. "It was only a matter of time," Iris said loudly enough for the porch to hear. Jessica opened the front door just in time to catch the rest. He never did let go of things, especially not where Evelyn was concerned. Jessica's expression remained neutral, but her mind noted the phrasing, "not where Evelyn was concerned." Back inside, Celia paced the hallway with uneven steps, muttering about bad blood and old poison. Evelyn had gone silent, wrapped in a shawl, her eyes fixed on the corner of the room, as though memory itself had taken form there. Whatever had happened between Arthur and Evelyn hadn't died with him. It had only grown quieter and deeper with time. The local police arrived with an air of quiet efficiency, a young sergeant and an older officer who introduced himself as Lieutenant Gardner. He wore plain clothes and an expression both courteous and unreadable. Jessica stayed to the side as Gardner began his questions, notebook in hand, voice measured. Evelyn answered in calm, rehearsed tones, her posture erect despite the pale cast in her cheeks. "No, I didn't see him arrive," she said. "I was in the kitchen." "Did you know Mr. Linney well?" Evelyn hesitated. "Then we were neighbors for some years." Gardner made a small note. "Any recent disagreements?" "There was nothing recent about it," Evelyn replied softly. "We disagreed long ago, and then we stopped speaking." Gardner raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Jessica's gaze wandered to the corner of the conservatory, where something caught the light. A ceramic vase, once part of a matching pair, she was certain, now lay cracked near the door. No one had mentioned it. The crack looked fresh. She walked closer, pretending to examine a plant. A small shard of porcelain glinted near the wall. Had it been broken in the scuffle, or after? Behind her, Evelyn's voice wavered. Arthur hadn't been in this house for years. Jessica turned, watching as the sergeant exchanged a glance with Gardner. The questions would deepen now, and so Jessica thought, must her own. As the officers continued their quiet investigation, Jessica slipped back into the conservatory. It had been temporarily cordoned off, but she knew well enough how to avoid interfering. She moved slowly, eyes tracing every surface, not for blood or fingerprints, but for the smaller signs. A shift in dust, a change in rhythm. There was no shattered glass, no damaged lock. The window on the east side hung slightly ajar, its old brass latch just unhooked. Not broken, not forced, opened. From the inside, or the out, Jessica leaned in. No footprints, but the edge of the sill bore a faint smear of soil, and just below it, on the wood paneling, a tiny scratch, as if someone had lost their balance. She turned, mentally charting the line from window to bookshelf. It would have been a direct path, or an escape. No sign of theft, no real evidence of a struggle. But Jessica didn't need drama to sense disruption. Something had shifted here, not in violence, but in intention. A confrontation, perhaps, a truth exposed. And whatever its cause, Arthur Linney had not left that room alive. The coroner's van departed just after noon, leaving behind only the murmurs of neighbors and the soft scrape of broom bristles as Celia cleared fallen soil from the conservatory tiles. Jessica stood on the back step with Evelyn, who hadn't said a word since the questioning ended. "He said he would ruin everything," Evelyn whispered suddenly, her voice so low Jessica barely caught the words. Jessica turned. "Arthur?" Evelyn nodded. "Last year, after Richard passed, he showed up at the gate. He told me secrets don't die just because husbands do." Then he laughed. Jessica felt the chill behind the words, not from threat, but from memory. "Did you believe him?" she asked gently. Evelyn's fingers clenched the edge of her shawl. "I didn't want to." Across the lawn, Thomas Bellamy stood watching them, hands in his coat pockets. When he saw Jessica looking, he turned away, but not before something flickered in his expression. Not fear, not guilt, but recognition. Jessica filed it silently. There was grief here, yes, but also something older, something that hadn't been spoken aloud in years. She looked back at Evelyn, whose eyes stared into the garden as though willing the past to stay where she'd buried it. But Jessica already knew. The past was no longer resting. The morning after Arthur Linney's death unfolded with deceptive calm. Pale sunlight streamed between the blinds of Jessica's guest room, and the air outside held a faint chill that whispered of summer's end. Jessica dressed slowly, her thoughts already mapping the day ahead. The faces from the garden, Iris Donnelly, Thomas Bellamy, Celia Marsh, lingered in her mind, not as neighbors but as variables in an emotional equation she had yet to solve. And now, with a death nestled among old grudges and silences, she felt the need to walk carefully, gently, not through the garden this time, but through memory's delicate terrain. She stepped out into the quiet circle of Wisteria Court, shoes clicking faintly on the pavement. There was no police tape, no buzz of reporters, only the subtle pressure of watchful eyes behind sheer curtains. The kind of morning where no one wore black, just practiced restraint. Jessica wasn't ready to name anyone guilty, not yet. But she had learned long ago that grief often brought its own kind of honesty. It loosened the threads people had carefully tied in place, and today she intended to follow where those threads began to fray. The Donnelly house was as exact as its occupant, trimmed boxwoods, freshly painted shutters, and a brass doorbell that gave a discreet chime. Iris welcomed Jessica in with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, leading her to a sitting room upholstered in cream and pale blue, everything gleaming, nothing lived in. Arthur was difficult, Iris said, pouring tea with clinical precision. But Evelyn always insisted on seeing what wasn't there. That's how people like her survive, I suppose. Through illusion. Jessica accepted the cup. You mean she was naive? Naive implies innocence. I'd say she was persistent. She wanted peace, and she created it. Whether it existed or not, there was no malice in Iris's tone, only a kind of brittle pride, as though she had spent a lifetime watching others mismanage their emotions while keeping hers in check. "And Arthur?" Jessica asked. Oh, Arthur had no use for softness. He believed Evelyn manipulated everyone with her silences, said she wore grief like perfume. Jessica sipped her tea. "And did he?" Iris tilted her head, considering. Arthur was blunt, not cruel, but bluntness can be just as dangerous when it goes unchecked, especially when it knows something. Jessica set her cup down gently. Knows something. The pause was so brief, it could have been missed. Then Iris smiled again. A sharp little curve of the lips. "I'm sure you'll understand what I mean in time." Jessica left a few minutes later, her notebook untouched, her mind scribbling furiously. Thomas Bellamy's home bore a different kind of order, less pristine, more curated. Bookshelves overflowed with volumes on theory and composition, and the faint scent of aged wood and varnish lingered in the air. Jessica was ushered in with a distracted nod and a gesture toward a velvet chair near the grand piano. "I don't speak ill of the dead," Thomas said, though his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the sheet music on the stand. "I'm not asking for scandal," Jessica replied gently. "Just insight." He sat, fingers brushing the keys absently. A low chord hummed in the stillness. Arthur had opinions, he said. Strong ones. He didn't believe in grace, called it decorative nonsense. Thought truth should be sharp enough to draw blood. Jessica watched him, and Evelyn, grace incarnate, which I suppose Arthur hated most of all. Or maybe he hated that she didn't break. The note he struck next was minor, unresolved. "There was a time," Thomas added, more quietly now, "when Evelyn meant something to me, before she married Richard. Before Arthur began insinuating things." Jessica leaned forward. "What kind of things?" He paused. "That Richard wasn't who he pretended to be, that Evelyn knew." Jessica waited, but instead of continuing, Thomas stood and gently closed the piano lid. "This house doesn't like raised voices," he said. And Jessica knew the interview was over. Jessica had barely reached the front gate when a rusted sedan turned onto Wisteria Court, tires crunching over gravel. The car halted abruptly outside Evelyn's house, and a young man stepped out, tall, lean, unshaven, with eyes like storm clouds and tension in every movement. "Cal Harrow." Jessica introduced herself as he moved up the steps, his duffel slung over one shoulder. "She called me last night," he said flatly. Didn't say much, just that something had happened. Inside, he tossed the duffel in the hallway and glanced around the room with an expression that mixed resentment and familiarity. "She keeps it exactly the same, even the smell." He looked at Jessica. "Did you know my father died in that armchair?" Jessica didn't flinch. "No, I didn't." Cal gave a bitter smile. "Peaceful," they said, but that man hadn't known peace in decades. They sat. Jessica asked gently, "Did Arthur Linney ever speak to you?" Cal's gaze hardened. "Yeah, usually to remind me that my inheritance wouldn't stretch far with my kind of ambition. He made a sport of it. Why would he care? Because he knew things. Things about Dad, about this house. He hated secrets, but he hated Evelyn's silence more." Jessica noted the word again. Secrets. As Cal leaned back, his foot tapped an old rug's edge, a nervous rhythm he didn't seem to notice. And Jessica wondered what he wasn't saying, or what he'd waited years to finally say aloud. The linen closet door creaked softly as Celia folded a stack of towels with crisp precision. Jessica stood nearby, watching the quiet ceremony of it. "Do you ever stop working?" she asked gently. Celia gave a tight smile. "Habit and comfort." Jessica stepped closer. "You knew Arthur Linney better than most here, I suspect." The folding paused. "I knew his noise, and his silences. He could wound with both. Jessica waited. Celia resumed folding. He once came here after dark, uninvited. Said he needed to speak to Mr. Harrow. Said he had a right. Jessica's eyes narrowed. When was this? A week before Richard died. The towel trembled slightly in Celia's hands. I heard arguing, not loud, but sharp. Mr. Harrow was angry, real angry. And Arthur, he left laughing. Jessica's voice softened. Do you know what they argued about? Celia hesitated, then looked straight at her. Arthur said he had proof that something Richard buried wasn't buried deep enough. Jessica absorbed the words, the phrasing deliberate. And Evelyn? She was in the garden, pretending not to hear. Celia placed the final towel on the stack. People keep secrets, Mrs. Fletcher, but secrets don't keep people. Jessica nodded, the sentence lingering like smoke. In that hallway of clean linen and silence, a part of the story had begun to turn. Back in her room, Jessica sat at the writing desk, the window open to the hush of early evening. She laid out her notebook, drawing lines between names, moments, tones, not facts yet, but impressions. Iris's polished spite, Thomas's unfinished grief, Cal's hardened bitterness, Celia's remembered voices, and Evelyn always centered, always withholding. Each story fit, but not together. She leaned back, eyes narrowing at the loose threads. Someone had lied, or perhaps everyone had, a little. The truth, she suspected, wasn't hidden. It was buried, carefully. She reached for her pen again, and kept listening to the silence. The afternoon had grown heavy with clouds when Jessica wandered into the sitting room, looking for something to occupy her thoughts. Evelyn was upstairs resting, and the house held the kind of silence that made even the ticking of the clock sound intrusive. Near the window stood a tall bookshelf filled with gardening books, titles arranged by height rather than subject. Jessica's hand drifted across the spines, the English rose, practical topiary, perennials for clay soil. Then her fingers paused. One volume, Old Garden Roses of New England, was set slightly apart from the others. It wasn't misaligned enough to seem accidental, but not straight enough to look deliberate either. She pulled it free and let it fall open in her hands. Near the center, pressed between two yellowing pages, lay a photograph. It had been folded once, now creased and soft at the edges, as though handled often but never quite discarded. Jessica unfolded it slowly. 4 people stood in a sun-dappled garden, a younger Evelyn smiling, Richard Harrow, trim and confident beside her, a third figure, familiar but aged now, and a jagged tear down the middle, where a 4th person had once stood. The missing piece, Jessica thought, was no accident. Jessica studied the photograph carefully, holding it at different angles as though the light might offer some unseen detail. The image had been taken in the very garden she'd walked through just days before. The trellis, the rose beds, even the chipped stone bench were visible in the background. Evelyn's hair was darker, pulled back in a softer style, and Richard looked relaxed, almost boyish. Arthur Linney stood to the left, not smiling, his arms loosely folded, his gaze slightly off camera, and then there was the tear. It ran clean through the space between Evelyn and Arthur, as if someone had gripped the photo with careful anger, and removed the final figure with precision. Jessica tilted her head. The absence wasn't just physical, it was narrative. The composition of the photograph had been changed entirely. What once might have been a warm group portrait was now a study in exclusion. Who had been in that missing corner? Jessica flipped the photograph over. No writing, no date. She refolded it and slipped it back between the pages of the rose book, then changed her mind. Instead, she placed it in her notebook. She stood still for a moment, trying to summon the edges of a memory. Someone had once spoken about a gathering years ago in the garden, but she couldn't recall who. Only that the conversation had ended awkwardly, as if something better left unsaid had nearly risen to the surface. Whatever was torn from that photograph wasn't forgotten. It had simply been erased. Jessica found Evelyn in the conservatory, tending to a pot of white cyclamen, their petals drooping delicately like bowed heads. The light through the glass gave her skin a translucent pallor, and she looked up at Jessica with a faint smile, as though already anticipating a question. "I came across one of your gardening books," Jessica began gently. A lovely photograph fell out. Evelyn turned slightly, her hand pausing over a watering can. "Oh?" she asked. "Which one?" "Old garden roses. It must have been taken here. You and Richard, Arthur was in it too." Evelyn's fingers resumed their motion, but a few drops of water spilled onto the tile. She didn't look up. "Yes, I remember," she said softly. "That was taken the year we planted the climbing Eden rose, just before Richard insisted on building the trellis." Jessica waited. Evelyn set the can down and adjusted one of the stems. "Arthur hated the color, said it reminded him of a funeral wreath." "And the fourth person?" Evelyn's hand stilled. "It was a long time ago, Jessica. Gardens change, people do too." Her tone was gracious, untroubled, a door closing with velvet softness. But Jessica knew deflection when she heard it. And this one was lined with grief. The house had returned to its familiar hush by late afternoon. Jessica moved through the side hallway that led from the conservatory to the kitchen, her mind still circling the torn photo and Evelyn's refusal to acknowledge it. As she passed the back entrance, something caught her attention, a pair of rain boots, resting against the wall just inside the door. They were speckled with dried mud, the soles thick with clinging debris. Jessica tilted her head. It hadn't rained in several days, and judging by the pattern of mud, they'd been worn in the garden, recently and not gently. She knelt to inspect them more closely. The boots were a men's size, large, scuffed and well worn, but not the kind of thing Richard would have left behind. Too modern, and not Evelyn's style either. Her own gardening shoes were neatly kept in the broom cupboard, spotless. Jessica reached out and pressed 2 fingers to the edge of the heel. The soil flaked slightly, still fresh enough to suggest use within the past 48 hours. She stood and looked around the hallway. No other shoes were out of place. Her thoughts turned unbidden to Cal Harrow. He had arrived in a rush, dropped his bag in the foyer, and said nothing about staying long. But someone had walked the garden, unannounced and unacknowledged, and whoever it was hadn't expected those boots to be noticed. But Jessica noticed everything, especially what others tried to step over. As Jessica stood near the back door, footsteps approached from the kitchen. Celia Marsh emerged, carrying a tray with a single teacup and a plate of dry biscuits. She stopped short when she saw Jessica by the boots. "Tea?" she asked, voice light, but not quite casual. Jessica nodded slowly. "Thank you, just admiring the state of the weather and the shoes." Celia set the tray down on a side table. "Those belong to the gardener," she said after a moment. "He comes by once a week, usually Tuesdays." Jessica sipped a tea. "But today's Friday." Celia didn't reply. Jessica looked at her. "Did you see anyone wear them recently?" Celia began adjusting the edge of the napkin on the tray. "I keep to my duties, Mrs. Fletcher. I don't inventory every footstep." There was no anger in her tone, only weariness. But Jessica caught the subtle glance, not toward the boots, but toward the stairwell leading up to the guest rooms. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Celia picked up the tray again and turned without another word. Jessica watched her go, thoughtful. Some lies weren't spoken. They were allowed to hang in the air, like steam from a cup no one really wanted. That evening, in the quiet of her guest room, Jessica laid the torn photograph beside her notebook. She'd drawn no conclusions yet, but the edges were beginning to align, not in clarity, but in pattern. Evelyn's refusal to acknowledge the missing person, Carl's sudden arrival, a pair of boots used on a dry day, a housekeeper who watched the world with careful restraint, and in the middle of it all, a photo someone had folded, then torn, then hidden, not in a drawer, but in a book about roses, as though sorrow could be pressed between pages like petals. Jessica turned the image over once more. The missing space tugged at her, as all absences do. The photo no longer asked who was missing. It asked why remove them, why preserve the memory, yet maim the story. Outside, the breeze rustled faintly through the arbor. She picked up her pen and made a quiet note. Someone wanted to disappear, or be disappeared, and then another. Perhaps the real question isn't who was there that day, but who was supposed to be. Jessica sat back, her fingers lightly touching the photo's edge. Some stories didn't hide in shadows. They bloomed in plain sight, but only for those who remembered how to look. The house had fallen into one of its quieter moods, the kind that settled over the floorboards like dust, soft and undisturbed. Jessica stepped out onto the veranda, drawn more by instinct than design. There in the long wicker chair by the trailing ivy, sat Evelyn, her hands resting in her lap over an untouched sewing basket. A needle glinted faintly between two fingers, held in place but never moved. She didn't look up right away. Jessica took a seat nearby, folding her hands and waiting. The light was gentle. Wind moved slowly through the vines, stirring the fringe of Evelyn's shawl, but she didn't shiver. She seemed neither cold nor warm, simply paused, like a thought not yet spoken. Jessica glanced down. Inside the basket lay several skeins of thread, a half-mended cuff, and a photograph tucked between layers of folded fabric. The needle slipped slightly. "I haven't sewn in years," Evelyn said suddenly, without preamble. Her voice was quiet, but not brittle. Richard liked the sound of it in the afternoons, said it made the house feel alive. Jessica said nothing, only listened, and in that quiet, something in Evelyn's posture began, just barely, to loosen. Evelyn didn't meet Jessica's eyes as she began speaking. Her gaze was fixed somewhere between the edge of the garden and the pale sky above it. "We met at a chamber concert." He was already well established then, Richard. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was always precise. Clean lines, nothing unnecessary. She smiled faintly. "That appealed to me." After a childhood of noise and contradiction, his silences felt like peace. Jessica nodded, not speaking, letting the rhythm unfold. "We married within a year, moved here a year later, built this house together. Every rosebush, every bit of trellis, he planned it all, measured everything twice." Evelyn let out a breath. He liked things that stayed where they were put. There was no bitterness in her tone, only a quiet recognition. He was never cruel, you know, just disciplined, in grief, in joy, in failure. Even when my first pregnancy ended early, he said nothing unkind, only that we'd try again. But we didn't. A silence passed between them, not awkward, but full. Jessica asked gently, "Did you love him?" Evelyn's reply came after a long moment. "I did, and I think he loved me. In the way men sometimes do from a distance they mistake for protection." Jessica watched her as she reached into the sewing basket and drew out a folded piece of linen. once a shirt sleeve perhaps. I learned how to be quiet too, Evelyn added. I thought that was what love meant. And then her voice, barely audible, I still don't know if I was right. Evelyn held the linen in her lap for a moment, before setting it aside, her fingers now tracing the edge of the basket as if searching for something else, something long lost. There was a winter, she began, when I almost left. Not because of cruelty, not even neglect, just the absence of being seen. Jessica listened without leaning forward, allowing space. It was around the time Arthur began visiting more often, always with something to say, or something to suggest. He liked pointing out where Richard had failed. Financial ventures, missed opportunities, old friendships gone cold. She paused. I wrote a letter to Arthur, not to invite anything, but to release something. Anger, frustration, my loneliness. I told him I knew he hated Richard, and that I didn't care what his reasons were. I wasn't interested. Evelyn's hands had stilled. I never sent it. I folded it and put it inside one of my gardening books. I found it last year, stained and yellow. I couldn't bring myself to read it again. Jessica asked gently, why? Because it reminded me I had come closer to betraying Richard than I ever admitted, even to myself. The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of old leaves and something fading. I never told him, Evelyn said, and that too was a choice. Jessica waited, sensing there was more, not from Evelyn's voice, but from her silence. The way her eyes had drifted, not toward the garden now, but toward the fireplace in the corner of the room. After Richard died, Evelyn said softly, I found a letter in his study, folded neatly, without an envelope, tucked behind a book of receipts. Jessica tilted her head. What did it say? Evelyn shook her head. I only read the first few lines. Her hands were folded now, fingers wrapped tightly, as if holding something that no longer existed. It was addressed to Arthur, not in greeting, but in confession. Richard wrote that he regretted their last argument, that there were things he never said, that he had held on to something, and that perhaps it had cost too much. Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly. And then, I burned it, Evelyn said. Her voice did not falter, but it lost all warmth. Before I reached the end, I couldn't bear the idea of Richard apologizing to a man who had spent years trying to dismantle our peace. She turned to Jessica now, her gaze sharp. Would you have read it? Jessica didn't answer, and Evelyn nodded, as if she'd expected that. There are truths that don't deserve to survive their speaker, she added. That letter. It would have rewritten everything. And I couldn't let it. Jessica let the words settle. Not every mystery lived in the facts. Some lived in what was refused, and what was destroyed to protect the version of love one could still live with. The air had grown still again. Even the branches outside had stopped moving, as though listening. Jessica sat with her hands folded, her gaze calm, though her mind turned with quiet urgency. Evelyn, for all her composure, seemed smaller now, not frail but folded in, the way someone looks when they've lived with their choices for so long they forget they ever had others. Jessica spoke gently. Do you believe Richard would have forgiven you for writing the letter, or burning his? Evelyn's lips pressed into a line. Forgiveness wasn't part of how we loved each other. We had rituals instead. Teacups, roses, Sunday crossword puzzles. Quiet things that meant more than confessions. Jessica nodded, understanding the shape of it, the way love sometimes becomes a performance so well rehearsed, no one remembers how it began. I don't regret staying, Evelyn said at last. But I do regret not asking more questions. The clock ticked on the mantel. A single hollow chime struck the hour. Jessica rose slowly and touched Evelyn's shoulder, a brief human gesture with no answers in it. And Evelyn, for the first time since Jessica's arrival, closed her eyes, not to rest, but as though to stop remembering. Evelyn stood soon after, gathering the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I think I'll lie down," she said. The winds picked up. Jessica watched as she moved through the doorway, her steps deliberate, her back straight, the kind of poise that came, not from pride, but from a life spent making certain no one ever saw her fall. Left alone, Jessica returned to the veranda chair, her thoughts gently unsettled. The letters, one unsent, one destroyed, floated in her mind like missing pages from a story that no longer fit its binding. Evelyn hadn't confessed, not in the traditional sense. She hadn't asked for forgiveness either. What she had offered was something more difficult to weigh, a window into a life lived with both dignity and doubt, into the soft erosion of truth between husband and wife, between appearance and reality. Jessica glanced toward the garden, where shadows were lengthening. Some answers wouldn't come through investigation or deduction. They would come in fragments, torn edges of memory, choices left unexplained, a lifetime built on what was not said. She opened her notebook again, not to write conclusions, but to leave room for what still had no name. The evening air carried a damp sweetness, laced with the perfume of overripe blossoms. Jessica moved softly along the gravel path, each step muted by moss and memory. The arbor stood ahead, cloaked in vines that twisted like secrets, old and tangled and unwilling to loosen their hold. Moonlight fell in slats through the lattice, catching on the edges of the wisteria blooms. Beneath them, the bench curved in quiet invitation. Someone was already there, seated, motionless, their silhouette turned inward. Jessica didn't call out. There was no need. This path had always led to this moment, not with urgency, but with inevitability. The tension in the house, the fragments of stories half told, the glances traded when people thought no one was looking, all of it had pointed here. She paused, just outside the arbor's edge, watching the figure seated in shadow. Not Evelyn, that would have been too simple. This was someone else, someone whose silence had weighed heavier than any confession. Jessica stepped into the moonlight and sat, not too close. The vines rustled above them, and the night, for all its softness, no longer felt so still. The figure didn't flinch as Jessica sat, though their shoulders stiffened momentarily. A long breath followed, not resignation, exactly, but release. As if the waiting had finally become heavier than the telling, Jessica kept her voice low. "You couldn't sleep either." A faint smile, bitter at the edges. "I haven't in years." It was Celia Marsh. Her hands were clasped in her lap, palms pressed tightly, as though still folded around linens long since washed and dried. Jessica didn't ask a question. "Not yet," Celia spoke first. "I thought I'd feel more afraid, if this moment ever came." "And do you?" Jessica asked gently. "No," Celia said. "Only tired." The quiet wrapped around them, thick and living. The wisteria creaked above as if listening. "I'm not here to accuse you," Jessica said. "But I think you've carried something alone for far too long." Celia nodded once. "I didn't kill out of hate." Jessica's hands rested on her knees. "I know." Celia's voice dropped to a whisper. "I loved him, not the way Evelyn did, not with rings and roses, but I saw him for who he was. And still, I stayed." Jessica waited. She could feel the confession rising, not with heat, but with sorrow. "You must understand," Celia said, her eyes still fixed on the ground. "It didn't happen all at once. It was years. years of watching something beautiful rot under the surface. And then more softly, until the day it finally collapsed. There was a moment, Celia began, her voice trembling, when the weight of everything we'd buried became louder than our silence. Jessica leaned forward slightly, her eyes steady. He came that morning, unannounced, Celia continued. Arthur, the same way he always did, smiling like a man who knew too much. He'd corner me in the hallway, or leave folded notes near the scullery, reminders that he could ruin what little peace remained. Jessica's breath caught, almost imperceptibly. What did he want from you? Power, Celia said. Control. I think he hated Evelyn for winning something he never could, and he hated me for seeing it. Her fingers flexed as if reaching for something that had long since slipped through. That day, he said things he hadn't before. Cruder, crueler, and he held the photograph, the one that Evelyn tore in half, the part she destroyed. Jessica didn't interrupt. He said he'd show it to Cal, said he'd tell him what Richard had hidden, what Evelyn had protected. And then he laughed. Celia looked away, her eyes shining. It wasn't rage, it wasn't revenge, it was desperation, to stop the lie before it became the only thing left of Richard's memory. A pause. I didn't mean to, I only grabbed what was there. The letter opener, he stumbled. I don't even remember the angle, I just remember how quiet he became. Jessica felt her heart tighten, not in judgment, but in the recognition of something deeply human and deeply tragic. Celia's voice was low now, almost broken by memory. I sat with him for a moment after, she said. Not long, just long enough to realize I'd crossed into something I couldn't return from. Jessica remained still, absorbing each word as if it had weight. He'd destroyed so much, Celia continued. Not with fists, not with poison, but with words. With the kind of truth that bends until it cuts. Her shoulders sagged under the years. He told me once that Evelyn was never Richard's first choice, that it was someone else, that everything since had been compensation. Jessica watched her closely. Was it true? I don't know, Celia said, and I don't think Evelyn did either. That's what made it cruel. The wind lifted through the arbor, stirring the scent of wisteria, cloying, almost suffocating. I burned the photo after, Celia confessed. The other half. I couldn't let it live, not when it would only deepen the wounds. Jessica's voice was gentle. And the boots, Celia managed a small, rueful laugh. Mine, from that night, I tried to clean them but couldn't. So I left them there, not hidden, not shown, like everything else in this house. There was no pride in her tone, only exhaustion. Jessica exhaled slowly. Some things can't be forgiven, but they can be understood. Celia nodded. And sometimes that's all we can ask. The vines above them rustled again, a living reminder of everything still entangled between the past and the truth. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of things that no longer needed to be said. Jessica reached out, her fingers brushing the worn slats of the bench between them. She didn't speak again. Not yet. Celia breathed slowly. I know what happens now. Jessica shook her head gently. Not tonight. Celia turned to look at her. Not with hope, but with relief. You won't protect me, she said. But you won't expose me either. I will let the truth rest where it can do the least harm, Jessica said. And where it might someday do some good. Celia looked out into the garden, eyes tracing the paths she'd walked for decades, in love, in regret, in servitude, and in silence. I never meant to hurt Evelyn, she whispered. But I couldn't let Arthur hurt her again, not with what he knew. Jessica said nothing. The moonlight offered no absolution, only clarity. Celia rose slowly, and for the first time in days, her steps were even. Jessica remained seated. A dog barked distantly. Somewhere a shutter creaked open, then closed, and beneath the heavy curtain of wisteria, Jessica opened her notebook one final time. She didn't write names or judgments, just one sentence. Some crimes begin with love and end with silence. And beneath it, a second line she couldn't help but add, but even silence leaves a pattern, if you listen long enough. The sun rose over Wisteria Court with an almost defiant gentleness, casting gold across dew-soaked hedges and the narrow brick paths Jessica had walked so many times before. The wisteria vines, once thick with shadows, now glowed lavender and pale pink in the morning light, petals trembling in the breeze, like they too were catching their breath. Jessica stepped onto the veranda, her shoes damp from the lingering mist. Smells. The air smelled of turned earth and something else, not quite sorrow, not quite relief. Change, perhaps. Everything looked the same. The neat hedgerows, the lattice fences, the familiar curve of the garden path, and yet she felt it in her chest. The small shift that comes after a truth is finally named aloud. Some wounds had no bandage, and some answers carried a silence heavier than the questions ever had. She paused by the conservatory door, its panes washed clean by last night's rain. The memory of Arthur's body still lingered there, not gruesome but persistent, like a breath that had never fully exhaled. And as the birds resumed their morning chorus, Jessica understood the mystery was over, but the healing had only just begun. Jessica walked slowly down the lane of Wisteria Court, where the day had begun without ceremony. Sprinklers ticked to life on manicured lawns, and kitchen windows glowed faintly with the warmth of breakfast preparations. Iris Donnelly was already tending to her begonias. Her back turned stiffly as Jessica passed. She offered a polite nod, not quite cold but no longer warm either. Whatever Iris had suspected or feared was now buried under the soil she gently tilled, one cautious bloom at a time. Thomas Bellamy stood near his porch, arms folded, his gaze flicking to Jessica before retreating into shadow. There had been no piano music this morning. Perhaps there wouldn't be for a while. Young Cal was not in sight. The tension in his posture the night before, when Evelyn stood without speaking, and he without apology, had left Jessica with a feeling too complex to name. Only Celia, glimpsed through the curtains of the Harrow home, met Jessica's eyes, not with guilt, and not with absolution. Just a quiet, fragile steadiness. The truth had done its work. It had cracked open the surface, let air into places long starved of it. Now each of them would live with what had been revealed. Jessica knocked softly, and the door opened as if it had been waiting for her. Evelyn stood by the window in her sitting room, framed in pale light, her figure motionless, not poised, but surrendered. "I made tea," she said, without turning. Jessica joined her in silence, settling into the same chair where so many careful conversations had unfolded. The tea sat untouched. "There's nothing to say, is there?" Evelyn murmured. Her hands trembled slightly, though her voice did not. Jessica shook her head. "Not everything needs to be said." Evelyn turned then, her eyes carrying something deeper than grief. A resignation aged by years of disappointment, softened only by the absence of further pretense. "I loved him once," she said, "and I suppose I hated him too." Jessica met her gaze. "Both can be true." Evelyn's smile was one. "I thought love would save the best parts of him, but it only prolonged the rest." They sat for a while without speaking, the kind of silence that holds not emptiness, but understanding. When Jessica rose to leave, Evelyn touched her hand, briefly, gently. Whatever passed between them in that moment, it needed no witness. only grace. The arbor was quiet when Jessica reached it, a hush more sacred than any chapel. The petals drifted down like snow, pale and transient, catching on the bench and the tips of her shoes. She stood beneath the tangled canopy of vines and blossoms, letting the silence rest around her. It was here the truth had stepped out of hiding. Here the final pieces of a broken story had been placed in careful order, not to punish, not to praise, but simply to see things as they had been. Jessica traced the curve of the wooden bench with her fingers, remembering the weight of Celia's words, the ache of Evelyn's restraint, the quiet grief of everyone who had played a role, however small, in a life unraveled. No one had planned this ending, but endings rarely arrive as we expect them to. Jessica closed her eyes for a moment, not in mourning but in recognition of all the longings buried beneath polished surfaces, and all the regrets that had gone unspoken for far too long. Some truths arrive too late to change anything, and yet, she thought, they matter all the same. She turned, leaving the arbor behind, but not forgetting. The suitcase felt unusually light as Jessica carried it down the steps. The morning sun had climbed higher now, casting long shadows behind every trimmed hedge and painted door. Wisteria Court stood quiet, neither hostile nor welcoming, simply still. She paused by the gate and glanced back. Evelyn's silhouette remained at the upstairs window, unmoving. Jessica didn't wave. Some goodbyes are better left implied. Her notebook lay closed in her bag, the torn photograph tucked within its final pages. She hadn't written everything. Some stories were not hers to tell, only to witness and understand. She breathed deeply, taking in the scent of turned earth, wet leaves, and faint blossoms. Not all wounds leave scars, she thought. Some leave flowers, soft reminders of what was broken and what tried, however imperfectly, to bloom again. As she stepped into the waiting cab, Jessica didn't look back a second time. The road unwound ahead of her, quiet and sunlit. Another town, another mystery, another heart speaking softly through the cracks of ordinary life. And as the driver pulled away, Jessica Fletcher allowed herself one final thought, that even in the darkest corners of the human heart, something kind can still take root, even now. And as the petals drifted silently beneath the arbor, Jessica knew that some truths bloom only after years of silence, and even then, not without cost. But tell me, was it justice that finally found its voice that night, or just the echo of a secret too heavy to carry any longer? I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you believe truly happened, and why? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed the mystery, do stay a while, like the video, share it with a friend who loves a good puzzle, and subscribe for more stories that linger in the heart long after the last page is turned.